and I welcome Mr. Hansen, the Executive Director of ECHA. It's the yearly visit, but there was a visit 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, but it's a good habit to have. So you have 10 minutes to present your work, your priorities, and also then we will open the floor to the various members concerned.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, honourable members, all in the audience. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to be back again. A few weeks ago, together with the other agencies that report to this committee, we presented ourselves, and this time it's me alone in our annual dialogue, as it's called, can present the results of the last year's work of ECHA and a bit of a looking forward from that. In our last discussion a year ago, the main take-home message that I got was that this committee, of course in a different constellation, had significant concerns about the progress that was being made in what's in REACH called compliance check. This was being written up in the press quite significantly, triggered by some studies that had been carried out that showed that quite substantial amount of data collected under REACH was not compliant. And I gave the promise that I would significantly increase the amount of work that we do in the Chemicals Agency on compliance check. I did not want to give you then a numeric target, but I hope that I'll be able, to your satisfaction, to report on that today. The other thing which has happened involving this committee over the last year is on the authorization of REACH, where there was yet another resolution objecting to a Commission decision granting an authorization, and through that resolution there was quite some comments on the work that we were doing in ECHA. And this resolution was, from our perspective and concerning the topics raised, a continuation of a number of other resolutions that this House has produced, and fully in line with our court judgment that came out in the spring, criticizing very much the same factors. And I hope I can also report now on what we've done with that. But let me go back to strategy, start with that. Our management board adopted in the end of 2018, so very shortly after our last dialogue, a strategic plan for the years 2019 to 2023. The strategic plan contains 3 strategic priorities, and if I summarize them unduly, then the first strategic priority is identify substances of concern and take action quickly. The second strategic plan is to support industry in getting information that we have in ECHA, but also registrants have in their companies down the supply chain, so that the actual worker using the substance gets the information he or she needs in order to protect himself, and to the consumer for the protection of the consumer and the environment. And the third strategic priority is that we as an agency ensure that our work that we do is better integrated with other pieces of legislation that concern chemicals that we are not implementing, other agencies, and the international agenda. Now, what have we achieved? If I go through the 3 strategic priorities, then I'll speak mainly to strategic priority 1, that's looking back. There are some things in terms of the supply chain and getting information down in strategic priority 2 that we've achieved that I'd like to mention. And then finally, strategic priority 3, I'll come with some of the achievements we've had, but also in particular look forward, because I see very much in the guidelines of President Ursula von der Leyen, and in particular in the context of the Green Deal and the Zero Pollution Agenda, a number of possibilities for us in the agency to support the work being done there. Starting with compliance, the target that we had last year for 2018 was 200 compliance checks, and I'm happy to report that we're well on target to reach 300 this year, or over 300. So we've increased the number of compliance checks by over 50%. As I speak today, we've finished 283 compliance checks, compliance checks on 283 substances, covering 2,318 registrations. So this is approximately a 50% increase over last year. And I do believe that that represents a significant increase, as I had promised this committee last year. On authorization, we've gone through quite substantial changes in the way we draft the opinions and the information that we give to the Commission in order to be aligned with the resolutions that you have come up with, but also with the court judgment. This, I won't go into any details unless you ask questions, so I'll leave it with saying that we've aligned ourselves to ensure that we respect the views that you came forward with and the court has come forward with. What I would like to mention is that we've been doing this at the same time as we have a significant amount of applications for authorization. We have 120 applications for authorization that are currently going through our part of the system. This compares to 22 in the whole of the year 2018 when I was here last time. So there's a 500%, 5 times increase in the number of applications for authorization. And we have therefore had to both accelerate, increase the number of staff working on it, and change substantially the way we work. On restrictions, we've continued the work, which at a very high intensity. There are quite a number of restrictions proposals which are currently going through the committees or being prepared by the agency. If I mention a few numbers, then we're currently preparing 4 in ECHA after being requested by the Commission. We have 9 restrictions which are undergoing discussion in the various committees, and we have 5 restrictions proposals that we have sent to the Commission and is undergoing decision-making there. And just to mention a few of them, there's one on tattoo inks, which is an area that has not up until now been regulated at EU level, which chemicals are allowed and not allowed in tattoo inks. We have one on microplastics, which is currently ongoing, and there is also another one ongoing on rubber infill in sports fields, for example. In particular, this is the shredded tires coming from end-of-life tires. Just to mention a few of the topics that we're covering there. But as mentioned, this is at a very high intensity. And based on that work, or knowing that that work was coming, what we have done within the agency is to substantially reorganize ourselves in order to accommodate for these challenges, both the ones in compliance check, the ones in restrictions, the ones in authorization, but also with the aim of being better placed to take on new tasks. So our organization as such, as an agency, but also the way we work, is organized along 3 axes. One is along competence centers. Another is that the whole agency is set up to start looking at groups of substances as a way of routinely looking at substances. So never look at a substance in isolation, but always in a group. And then finally, with this organization along groups of substances and competences, we believe that we can much easier take on new tasks. And what this means with easier is that they can get started quicker with lesser than before. Of the new tasks that we have taken on, just to mention a few, we've now become operational with the poison centers. So this is a database and information collection from industry where we disseminate information back to the member states so that emergency telephone authorities can give advice in case of emergency in, for example, households in the use of chemicals. We are also well on schedule in developing the waste database, which we discussed slightly last time as being a critical database to get up and running, but we are progressing well, and we are now in place to systematically take on work coming from DG Employment on occupational exposure limit values. If I go to the strategic priority 2 and simply mention the work we're doing on supply chain, then we have worked considerably on establishing efficiencies to get information that from the thousands of registrants containing significant amount of chemical information on chemicals, much better and much more efficient, down to companies that are actually using the chemicals. So on the REACH side, we've made considerable progress. We are now talking with the member states and with the Commission, because one of the big obstacles that's preventing the use of this valuable information by workers on the work floor is the interface with the OSH, the Occupational Safety and Health legislation, and these obstacles need to be overcome in order for REACH to reap in the full benefit, or rather for the OSH, the worker protection, to reap in the full benefit of all the work and information that's being generated under REACH. Finally, I can say in strategic priority 3, so this is looking out towards the other legislation, but also internationally. Some of the things, a major milestone that we have made is a cooperation with the European Food Safety Agency, that we are supporting the EFSA in implementing the new food law, in particular through the support of development of IT systems to gather data and publish data on the internet as required by the food law. And this is seen as a very tangible cooperation between the two agencies, so we will be building identical systems used in EFSA and in ECHA for these purposes, and thereby create both synergies but also consistency in work. If I look a little bit forward and look at what is coming the next couple of years, then clearly for ECHA we have our plate full of tasks. As I mentioned, our compliance check activity have significantly increased, and we intend to keep it at that high level for the next 7 years in order to be able to say in 2027 that we have looked at all substances on the European market and determined whether risk management is needed or not. We see that within the Green Deal, at least what we read into it, is an opportunity to further streamline a lot of the chemicals legislation, along with the recommendations which are embedded in the Commission's fitness check of all chemicals legislation except REACH, and thereby enable more efficiencies and better consistency between more pieces of chemicals legislation, thereby reducing the administrative burden on companies, but at the same time also increasing the level of protection. Finally, one note on resources up front. We're concerned with any cuts that the agency might get, and this is basically based on the presumption that the demand on us will stay as it is today, and as I'm sure I'll hear from you today, that you want us to do a lot of compliance work, you want us to do a lot of authorization work, you want us to do a lot of restrictions work, and you want us to contribute to whatever can be unfolding politically under the Green Deal and the zero pollution agenda. And for that, my expectation is that we would need a steady resourcing in ECHA. And at the moment, with the Commission's proposal, this is not exactly fulfilled, but if you want to discuss any details on that, we can do that afterwards. So with that, I'd like to finish my introduction, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So I'm going to give the floor to start the debate with the NV contact person for your agency, Martin Offrich.
Thank you very much, and welcome back. I would be wondering, and you already partially touched on the Green Deal. How are you, and if at all, are you involved from the Commission side in this? I think this is something which is going to be definitely very important. I hope the Commission is already doing that. But also, I would like to hear from you more about how do you perceive the challenges ahead in terms of helping to drive the innovation on safer chemicals. But also in one particular topic which relates to consumer safety, and that's the importation of products from China and the booming online market, the Alibaba's wishlist and all the others. How do you think that, what's your take on where ECHA can help to tackle these challenges? Thank you.
Okay, so you want to answer that one first? The contact person, that would be the privilege, and then the round of questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. I'll start with the bigger picture, Green Deal. I mean, our involvement is, of course, one of telling the Commission what we think we could do should they decide to do something. So it's a little bit of a hypothetical discussion point. But our basic fundamental line is, I would say, two things. One is concerning circular economy, and the other one is concerning the integration, better integration of existing legislation. If I start with the latter, this is what I briefly mentioned before, but there are still around 40 pieces of legislation, EU legislation, which govern chemicals from one angle or another, and which do things slightly different and at different times on the same chemicals that we look at in ECHA. And I believe that by analyzing these other pieces of legislation, or rather taking the consequences of the analysis the Commission has already done, we can gain considerably in efficiency and consistency in implementing other pieces of legislation. If I give you some examples, there's the Water Framework Directive, which sets water quality standards concerning chemicals. There is the restriction of hazardous substances in waste. And there is what you already discussed in the agenda point before this. For example, in drinking water and the drinking water materials legislation, there's a discussion in the trialogue ongoing that we should take on further tasks there. And basically, these are all pieces of legislation where if we take on tasks in supporting them, we can ensure consistency and synergies. And I think in terms of the citizen, synergies means it can be cheaper, and consistency means that they don't get confused with different messages. A chemical is a chemical no matter how it's used, and our assessment would ensure that consistency. On the circular economy part, for me, looking at the world and the communications of the Commissions on circular economy, I see circular economy as having in particular a focus on looking at materials and them going through circularity, and a material is nothing else than a mixture of chemicals. So in ensuring the safety of those chemicals used in a circular economy, we see ourselves being able to play a central role, but also in promoting innovation into chemicals that are circular and can be used better in recycling. In terms of challenges of innovation, that's one of them, but in general, the substitution challenge of substituting, say, more hazardous substances by less, in particular substances, of very high concern. I think looking at what REACH and classification and labeling have done together, but also a number of the other legislations we work on, biocides and persistent organic pollutants, they do push substitution away from very hazardous substance, very risky substances, into less risky. And there, for example, in the chromium authorization process, there have been quite some innovation in new processes using, rather than chromium-6, using chromium-3, which is considerably less toxic and thereby considerably less risky. So I see that the implementation on the ground that we do definitely pushes innovation, but I also see, of course, one can always do more if the resources are there. But we're on a very good track in pushing innovation on the safety side. If we get to circular economy, that innovation needs to be pushed in addition on the circularity side. And finally, import of products. It's mainly in the hands of the lawmakers and you. The part that we do in ECHA is that we coordinate enforcement officers, and in that work that we do there, we definitely want to strengthen our collaboration with member state enforcement to ensure better that the borders are protected from illegal products coming in, for example, as you mentioned, from China.
Thank you. So we have the Catch the Eye session. So don't hesitate to put yourself on the list. We start with Peter Liese.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Hansen. You mentioned a number of points, also very specific points that I'd like to go into. And I'd like to ask you a general question on that. When it comes to chromium, that was a topic in Parliament the month before last. We had a very close decision. I was one of those who said to the Commission that chromium-6 is still essential. I'd like to know how you assess the alternatives, because on the one hand, we have SMEs, and in the motion that we voted on in October, and in the public hearing, nobody said that there's an alternative. It was claimed that there are alternatives since then, and we've discussed also with your predecessor as to how SMEs can meet these requirements, and it seems to be a contradiction. We have a hearing. Nobody says there's an alternative. Nonetheless, we require the SMEs to use an alternative, which nobody knows. Secondly, on tyres, as you said, there is a certain split between the circular economy and the need to reduce toxic substances. As far as I know, in many applications with used tyres, people are exposed to hazardous chemicals, but we can only take these hazardous substances out of the production process after a number of years, and they exist in tyres. If there's no risk for people, we have to find compromises. The third point, I welcome the fact that together with DG Employment, you're working very closely with them. Most substances are a risk in the production process. There we must have very strict rules, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a problem for the end user. And so there, the solution might be to work on the rules for employees and, if necessary, to tighten them.
Thank you. Jutta Gutterlund for SND.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hansen, for being here with us again and for your introduction. We have already discussed the study by the German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment and the German Environmental Agency that revealed that a third of the high production volume chemicals made or imported into Europe since 2010 break EU laws designed to protect public and the environment from harmful exposure. Just 31% were declared as legally compliant, with the rest needing more investigation. The REACH regulation obliged companies to report to ECHA whether their substances are causing cancer, neurotoxic, mutagenic, bioaccumulative, or harmful to children or human fertility. No authorization shall be guaranteed to substances with hazardous properties where more data needs to be generated to conclude the potential risk. And I think you agree to that. And I would like to know if you agree that there is a problem, that Europe is really having this problem, authorizing substances, although the required information is not there or missing. And moreover, I also want to ask if you are preparing an action plan to improve compliance. When will we see this action plan, and can you already now give us some few ideas of what action is foreseen? And then I want to ask also if I know that only 20% of all applications are actually tested in Europe. Why is that? And then two last, not so small questions, but I take my opportunity here. I would also like to ask you on the grouping approach. I understand you will be working with this as of next year and that you will compare the new substances in low volumes with similar ones. And can you explain this approach a bit more in detail, please? And finally, the microplastics. ECHA has proposed, as you of course know, to ban added microplastics in products such as toothpaste, cosmetics, and so on. And when can we see the overview and action on this, and what can we expect? Thank you.
For the Greens, Jutta Paulus.
Hello, Mr. Hansen. Nice to see you again, and thanks for coming again to us and giving us insights into your work. Some of the questions have already been raised by my colleagues. I would also be interested what percentage of REACH dossiers is actually being checked today. It should be increased to 20%, as we all know, but I would like to know where we stand now. And also, when do you think that dossiers will be fully compliant so that we won't have these high rates which Ms. Guteland has already mentioned? The second question is around authorizations. I think we have seen in the last mandate, as I was told, but also in this mandate, problematic authorizations such as chromium-6, because I think if an applicant doesn't give a complete dossier with all required information, then authorization should not be granted, and this should not be tolerated. And also, I've seen that RAG and SEAC recommend authorizations due to economic advantages, but I think this should be left to the Commission because RAG and SEAC should only do risk assessment. And also, I would like to know how a proper assessment of potential substitutes is done, because up to now I haven't seen any, and I think instead of granting authorizations by having a more proper assessment on possible substitutes, we could really foster innovation in that case. And the third question is, I would be very happy to hear your opinion on the titanium dioxide question, which we will be debating on within this sitting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. For the GUE, Anja Zakamp.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Hansen, for your presentation. I have a question about the cosmetics regulation. The EU cosmetics regulation adopted in 2013, which bans animal testing for cosmetic products and for their ingredients, was a groundbreaking success. However, the European Chemicals Agency and the Commission are still insisting to test cosmetic ingredients on animals in the framework of the REACH chemicals regulation. And under REACH, animal testing is required for chemicals used in cosmetics when there is a possibility of workforce exposure during manufacturing processes, but also for substances used not only in cosmetics, tests on animals are permitted regardless of any worker exposure risk. This practice undermines the cosmetics regulation and implies that the REACH regulation overrules the animal testing ban. And all this without informing the consumers properly. Do you agree, Mr. Hansen, that your practices under the REACH regulation undermine the EU cosmetics regulation and the ban on animal testing for cosmetics? And how are you going to solve this major problem, which is also misleading consumers? Thank you.
Thank you. So the last two ones, I'm Novak from the EPP.
Hvala.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the floor. Mr. Hansen. Thank you for your presentation. It was a very good presentation. But I've got a few questions. Are the results of your work taken into account when the EU is negotiating trade deals with third countries? If so, who supervises this? I've asked this question many times in different fora, but I haven't received a satisfactory answer yet. How can we be sure that products imported from third countries don't include harmful chemicals? So, who is doing the supervision, and are your analyses taken into account in trade agreements? Thank you.
Thank you. Last question from the EPP, Madame Spiraki.
Thank you, Chair. It is very special, but I would like to have some kind of further information on the file of titanium dioxide that we'll discuss later. So I would like to ask you, first of all, what is the foreseen timing for the revision of the waste guidance by DG ENVI concerning the titanium dioxide classification? Because I think that we must ensure that the guidance will be in place by the time that the classification enters into force to avoid confusion and disruption. And concerning your competence, I would like to ask if first, in the draft version and the delegated act was a reference for materials placed in the market, but now this kind of reference has been removed. Do you have any idea why has been that taking place? And secondly, I would like to say that concerning your report on titanium dioxide, are you ready to put some kind of clarification as to Annex 3, Note 10, for the example of putting the word dry in front of the term of powder and the percent of some moisture in the powder? Because as it is mentioned in this text, there are processing and recycling projects where titanium dioxide in reality is present and is not inhalable. So I think that there could be a kind of confusion in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot of concrete questions, yes. So we expect concrete answers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll do my best. I'll start with compliance check authorization. Compliance check first, then go to authorization, and then some of the issues on restrictions, and then go to the more broad issues regarding trade, employment, cosmetics, and titanium dioxide. On compliance check, yes, we've agreed with the Commission that we would increase the amount of dossiers that we compliance check from 5% to 20%. And the Commission has made a proposal to the relevant committee, who has also adopted this. So we have an increase of the percentage in REACH from 5% to 20%. This concerns the number of dossiers. We expect that if you look at the number of substances that this covers, and I'll go into the maths if you want to, but it's rather complicated, but this corresponds to somewhere between 30 and 40% of all substances that are registered, that we thereby will be looking at through compliance check. For all the other substances, we will look at them from the perspective of, do we think that they can be risk managed immediately, meaning there's no need to generate further data, but one can go immediately to classification and labeling, as an example, restrictions or authorization, or other types of union instruments like occupational exposure limit values, or we actually think that there is so much risk management already in place that there is no need to further work on that substance. And then there's a third type of group, or a third type of conclusion that we will be getting to, and that is that we see the substance, we do not believe the substance is of any concern, but the data might not be compliant. I can again go into the technical details of that types of substances, but there are some substances which are generally understood as not being and our experts agree are not toxic, but the registrant has not done a great job at demonstrating this. Those types of substances we're putting at lower priority, but we'll of course discuss with the registrants to make sure that they get their or improve their registration dossiers. But our goal is by 2027 to have looked at all registered substances and put them either through compliance check, put them to risk management, or conclude that no risk management is needed because what is already in force is very strong, or this third category that they may be compliant, may not be compliant, but there's really not need to generate the data. This would be generate excessive cost use of animals, and there's really no need to do it through testing, but more of improving the dossier as such. That we will do for all substances, as I said, by 2027. On authorization, now maybe I should take here the grouping at the same time. What we intend to do, or actually we're already doing it, but we will do it systematically as of January 1st next year, is that all substances that we consider within any of our so-called processes, so that's within evaluation, restrictions, authorization, or looking at other pieces of legislation, we will always look at all substances which are chemically similar, whether they are registered at lower volumes or even in some cases not even registered at all, in order to see if one can come with a more robust conclusion which concerns not only that substance but all substances in a group. And like I said, we will be doing that mainstream from next year, and we are the first agency in the world that has committed to doing so, and also, as I said in the beginning, completely reorganized ourselves to be able to do that. If I move to authorization, then I think there is an issue of substitutes, and let me just say generically that authorization is a new system. It still is relatively new if you compare it with the previous authorization systems. It does take some time for it to be completely running smoothly, but also that all actors out there in Europe are aware that there is an authorization system that they can contribute to. What we're doing in terms of alternatives is that we have clarified significantly what our work is and what the Commission's work is, both in terms of alternatives, also in terms of the socio-economic analysis, and in particular the conclusions whether an authorization should be granted or not. That all of that is very clearly in the realm of the Commission, and we give the information now in our newest opinions, so to enable the Commission to take that decision. Evidently, the opinions or the decisions the Commission is taking today are based on old opinions from us and therefore are not yet in this new format. But once the wave of opinions that now are being produced trickle through to the Commission, my expectations would be that that would be at some point in the second half of next year. Then you will see this also in the opinions coming out of the Commission. But we have made a very clear dividing line between what is our responsibility and what of the Commission. We promote very much on our website and talking to companies that they bring alternatives. We talk with the individual applicants, what it means for them to do an analysis of alternatives and look for alternatives. And in general, we think that this year is improving. And like I said, on the chromium case, this substitution with chromium-3 and some other very innovative technologies is something which came up during the authorization process. And of course, we want this here to happen before we actually are doing the opinions in ECHA. But this is an issue of spreading the good news around Europe and having these alternative manufacturers or alternative users of chemicals come forward earlier. We're still working on this. There's still a lot of room for improvement, but we do see the improvements. On chromium-6 in particular, I do think that it's also worth noting that all the opinions that we have come up with, in those, the companies who have requested an authorization have committed to keeping a limit value of 2 ppm at the workplace. And this is a factor 5 below the occupational exposure limit value. So the REACH authorization is providing even more protection for workers than did the occupational exposure limit value as such. So the two are complementary and working very well together to protect workers. Let me move to restrictions. There's the issue of tires, and indeed there is in the short term always a discussion about legacy chemicals that are banned in primary materials and then them coming back as coming back into the economy as secondary materials. And I think that this is something that we in the agency can assess, but obviously it's something for policy to decide whether they want to have a lower level of protection coming, or rather they would accept higher concentrations of a legacy chemical coming from secondary materials than they would in the primary materials, creating, of course, a distortion in the economy, but on the other hand, also promoting recycling. Microplastics, there we indeed are, I need to be very articulate in the terminology. I think it's the Secretariat in ECHA has produced a restrictions proposal, indeed phasing out the use of microplastics in all intended uses of it in Europe. And that proposal is being discussed in ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee, and we expect its opinions to be finished in the Risk Assessment Committee and in the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee next year, and that it then can move to the Commission for its decision to implement or not, or modify based on our recommendation of the scientific and technical evidence. So we will finish within the 15 months deadline that REACH places on us.
Any timeline that we could expect?
Can I ask my colleagues, so that I don't say something, just to check it and then come back? When is it we are expecting the opinion from the RAC and the SEAC? Oh, it's being communicated to me. June next year. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. So June, we will finish our work and hand over the opinions of the two committees to the Commission for it to take its decisions. Part of that analysis has of course also been looking at alternatives to the use of microplastics. So just back to the original discussion there, and therefore also looking at how long does it take to implement alternatives, and thereby having this also as an instrument to promote the use of finding alternatives that are simply safer. If I then move to the bigger areas, I perfectly agree on the comments with employment and occupational safety health. There is a need to further integrate and further utilize the strengths of the two areas to get synergies and thereby end up protecting the worker better, but also at a lower cost for the employer. And I believe that there are significant opportunities there. The occupational exposure limit value work that we are doing in supporting scientifically is just the beginning, but there are significant opportunities to improve. But that requires a proactive discussion and compromise from both sides in order to ensure that this happens. And here, compromise, I don't mean politically. It's very much an issue of habits and technical issues. Cosmetics, no, I do not agree that REACH undermines the cosmetics regulation and its ban, and the ban on animals. I believe that the way we are implementing it complements and respects the division that is there between the ban for animal testing and cosmetics and REACH. In the REACH world, including classification and labeling in POPs and the other pieces of legislation we implement, we do not see the possibility to ensure safety from chemicals in Europe to the consumer in other applications than cosmetics or to workers without animal testing. generically. And therefore, we see this, there is a friction between the political desire to not have any testing on animals for any substance that is used in cosmetics versus what in REACH, as an example, is required to ensure safety of workers using these chemicals. Now, that is more of a perception because, as I said, there is a very fine line, but well defined, between exactly when the test in REACH would be required, and you've mentioned it, compared to under cosmetics. On the trade deal, I mean, in general, ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, has no entity outside of Europe. When we sit at conferences of the parties or anywhere else, we always sit behind the EU flag, very often supporting technically the Commission. So in terms of trade deals, no, we're not involved in trade deals directly. We do get questions through our partner services on occasions, but this is not our realm. In terms of imports, how can we be sure that they are compliant with legislation? Well, I think the REACH review, but also chemicals industry and industry at large, very often says we need more enforcement at the borders to make it, to catch the illegal imports. We play a very small role there, but we do play a role in coordinating and discussion with enforcement authorities in member states. And as I said before, we will work on increasing that, the efforts and work. But our work alone will only be a marginal improvement compared to the overall need for increasing enforcement at the borders. If I move to titanium dioxide, first, apologies. I will not be able to answer these very technical issues. I didn't come prepared, having to have read our opinion from the Risk Assessment Committee in grand detail. So this issue about a technical note in an annex, there I can't answer here, but I would be happy to do this in writing after consulting the colleagues. But in general, this committee and, of course, Parliament has its role to play, which is outlined in the treaty in terms of decision-making by the Commission. My role is to be aware of what comes out of it, and I'm particularly aware if there is a resolution which seems to contradict or criticize the scientific opinion that we have in ECHA. And in this, what I've managed to read here, I see one part of the story, but I don't see the other part of the story. And if I can just say in general, without going into any grand detail, what I see is that ECHA believes that titanium dioxide is a carcinogen by inhalation, scientifically, category 2. So it's correct that it's not category 1A, 1B, but we do believe it's a carcinogen by inhalation category 2. All the science that we have demonstrates this. And we've applied the science that we have, and I'll tell you where it comes from, to the criteria in the globally harmonized system. And we have put that in front of the Risk Assessment Committee, which is the committee that you, among others, have decided should have a scientific view on this. The data we looked at is the data that industry considered met the requirements for REACH. And if we take the data that they believe meet the requirements for REACH, then the Risk Assessment Committee believes that it meets the criteria for being a carcinogen by inhalation category 2. Now, if industry doesn't like that data, then we, of course, have a problem in REACH. But they submitted the data years ago and said that this is the data that fulfills their information requirements. So, in effect, that part of the story on the data, we believe it is a carcinogen by inhalation. The link with OEL, we do have a risk management competence in ECHA, so I'll be speaking exactly from that risk management competence. That, of course, setting up an OEL can very well be a good risk management tool. But to see it as an alternative to classification is a priori a little bit difficult for me to see, and I'll explain why. Very shortly. The reason why we classify substances is to allow workers on the work floor, when they're picking up the jar with the chemical in it, to understand that this is a carcinogen or not. And if that label is not on it, then the worker doesn't know that it's a carcinogen and obviously will not pay as much attention as if there is a label on it that says it is a carcinogen. So most risk management work that we do in the union and have built all our instruments on is based on communication to the worker, that they know what it is that they are dealing with. And not classifying, but setting occupational exposure limit value is a little bit like having a curvy road where you have a lot of danger signs for it being curvy, and you decide that you want to reduce accidents by setting a 30-kilometer speed limit, but you also remove the signs. And that seems a little bit not intuitive. And that same unintuitive approach I would see in terms of protecting the workers, that the worker, even though they have an OEL, they first really know what it is they're dealing with when they see the labels on the jar. So that's sort of my initial reflections, also having only seen it this morning and understanding that you're debating this afterwards.
And we vote tomorrow. So if ever you have things to share, it would be good to have it before tomorrow. So for the closing remarks, I will ask one of the two representatives of the Parliament on the ECHA Management Board for a few comments. Professor Christelle Bernards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I took note of the very interesting points raised in this meeting. However, I shall not go into answering this or replying to these specific questions. It was my first year as a member of the Management Board, and I would like to share 3 points with you which keep my mind. First of all, I noticed that ECHA tries to most promptly act on priorities and tasks put forward by the EP and the Commission, and tries to optimize and aligns his works with his strategic plan. ECHA does this by optimally allocating resources, personnel and expertise, and optimize procedures and processes to increase throughput and efficiency in its tasks. The examples were given. These changes are always verified with the Management Board and approved if they agree. 2 points which I always see as some challenges returning at the Management Board's meetings. The first of all is that about the budget. We see that the ECHA is living with a variable budget. Incomes are variable. ECHA keeps with us informed about good predictions about the fee incomes, and thus far has met all the tasks put forward. But it could be become challenging if more tasks will be assigned to ECHA without additional resources. And then the second challenge is ECHA is a very digitalized agency. It's dedicating many resources to databases and information exchange. Thus far, ECHA has met all prescribed deadlines, and I will keep an eye on that it will keep on doing that, despite the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are now ending this annual dialogue, as you said. But of course, as we expect a new zero pollution strategy coming from the Commission in the context of the Green Deal, your expertise will be more than welcomed in the coming weeks, months, and years. So see you soon in front of the ENVI committee, either yourself or your team, and thank you for what you're doing. So we move to the other agenda item, number 6, starting with the objection.